Hello, my loves, and welcome back to Strange Playgrounds, whatever episode this happens to be. I have so many of these things in the can at the moment, some of which will make it out into the world, some of which probably won't because they're probably going to be shit. That's kind of the way I work with this podcast. I just record whenever I feel like talking about something. And I know last episode there are the two subjects that I have to talk about, Korean and Japanese and Chinese horror. I will get onto that, and magic in the Harry Potter universe. I'll talk about both of those at some point. But something has come up, and it seems to be something that's quite consistent this year. Yet another television program that has snared my fascination. Apparently, there is going to be a recreation of Jim Henson's The Storyteller. Now, The Storyteller is it's a seminal piece of work, and for me, it's a formative one. It was my original introduction to Grimm's fairy tales. For those who don't know, The Storyteller was a beautiful television series back in the 1980s, early 1990s, that had two seasons. The first season was adaptations of the Grimm fairy tales as told by the eponymous storyteller, who was played by John Hurt. And they were very, very faithful recreations of the original Grimm fairy tales, warts and all, often retaining all of their darker elements. And rendered with Jim Henson puppets and with live action actors. The episodes are phenomenally beautiful. They are not just sort of dramatized retellings of the Grimm fairy tales. They're often very surreal or abstract in the way they're portrayed. They're often portrayed symbolically or in these very experimental ways, and they're beautiful. Having gone back to them many, many times since I was a child, they are stunning examples of storytelling, and it's watching them, it's hardly surprising that I came out as I have, that I've come out with the interests and the obsessions that I have. They are just beautiful. As a child, I was besotted by the imagery and by the storytelling. As an adult, I'm absolutely enraptured by how beautiful they are, how well put together, how beautifully told, the rhythms of the storytelling, the puppetry in these is amazing. It's Jim Henson, and it's at a time when Jim Henson's studio was just riding high. They were doing the most beautiful experimental stuff. There's one episode in particular which is a retelling of The Luck Child, one of the more infamous Grimm fairy tales that involves a griffin, and the griffin is this enormous live action puppet that is one of the most ambitious in the entire show because it is huge. It obviously requires multiple operators, lots of mechanisms, and it has a pelt of feathers that look like they're real feathers. It is an astounding work of puppetry, and the way it interacts with the live action actors is beautiful. For my tastes, my absolute favorite of all of them is the first episode of the entire show, which is it's a recreation of the Russian folktale, The Soldier and Death. For those who don't know, The Soldier and Death is a beautiful story, like a lot of Russian folktales, beautifully despairing. It's a beautifully despairing tale about a Russian soldier who is on his way home from some unspecified war, and all he has to his name are 3 dried biscuits. Along the way, he encounters 3 beggars, all of whom give him particular gifts because he shares his biscuits with them. One of them gives him a better whistle because his whistle is particularly tuneless. One of them gives him a much more enthusiastic dance because his dance is awkward and ungainly. And the last one gives him a magic sack. And the magic sack is the fulcrum of the story. The sack has the capacity to basically anything the soldier calls into the sack, any living thing, will be compelled to crawl into the sack. And he does it with all sorts of things. He does it with geese. He exercises a castle of devils by calling the devils into the sack. But the big thing he does, which is where the title of the story comes from, he calls death itself into the sack, the spectre of death. And as a result of that, suddenly nobody dies. And initially he's praised as a kind of saint, but however, it becomes very apparent that he's done something terribly wrong. He's upset the natural order. There are wars being fought, and nobody's dying. There are star-crossed lovers hurling themselves off of cliffs and not dying. There are ancient, weary, diseased souls who just want relief, who aren't dying. So he releases death. But as a result of what he did, death is terrified of him, so never comes for him. The soldier is condemned to walk the world as an immortal forever. In the original story, he drags himself all the way up to heaven and they won't let him in, and he drags himself all the way down to hell and they won't let him in. And the end of the story is so sad. He just has to wander forever. He hasn't got any choice in the matter. It's absolutely beautiful, and the recreation of it in the Jim Henson show is sublime. It's absolutely sublime. It's got enough of the threatening and the dark as intermingled with some humorous elements. It's real, but it also retains the darkness of the story. The ending, in particular, it really plays up. It's very sad indeed, and all of them are like that. All of them are like that. They are absolutely beautiful shows and beautiful stories. If you haven't ever seen it, I would highly recommend going to find it. The second season was very different. It was the storyteller was replaced by Michael Gambon in that series, and rather than being the grim fairy tales, Michael Gambon told select Greek myths, and they were beautiful too. There's Orpheus and Eurydice, for example. Total tragedy. I mean, Orpheus and Eurydice is one of the saddest stories in Greek mythology, and again doesn't shy away from the nastier elements. The story of Icarus. Oh, Jesus God, the story of Icarus. I don't know whether any of you know the story of Icarus, just outside the symbolism, the boy in the wings flies too close to the sun, falls to his death. But that story is so tragic. It's so tragic. It's a story of the Greek gods being utter pricks, as they are generally, playing with the lives of mortals and inducing tragedy for their own amusement, to see how far they can push mortals before they break. It's really dark. It's phenomenally dark. It involves the deaths of two children, actually, that story, one of which is a murder. It's very, very sad, but this recreation goes for it. It tells every aspect of the story without shying away from it. There's Theseus and the Gorgon, not Perseus and the Gorgon, rather, not Theseus. Theseus and the Minotaur, and Perseus and the Gorgons. Beautiful, beautiful stories, and very well rendered. The Gorgons, in particular, are fantastically horrible in this series. It's a stunning show. For children, for adults, it's one of those stories, it's one of those shows that really has a genuine love of storytelling. It celebrates these stories. It doesn't try to modernize them. It doesn't try to make them sort of wisecracking. This is pre-Aladdin. This is pre-Disney's Aladdin, fortunately. So it doesn't try to make them wisecracking. It doesn't try to introduce modern characters or references. They're just earnest recreations of these stories. And it is beautiful. It is phenomenally beautiful. They are inspiring. They're absolutely inspiring, and because they are operating at something of a technical limitations and within budgets, they use symbolism a hell of a lot, and they use very, very old techniques to utilize special effects, and it works. Somehow that enhances the slightly fairy tale feeling of these stories, and it makes them slightly preternatural, slightly removed from reality, and it's beautiful. It's one of my favorite television shows of all time, I have to say, and the notion that they're recreating it fills me at once with joy and fear. Joy and fear. It fills me with fear because we now are in a post-Disney's Aladdin world. And I don't know whether any of you have noticed, but Disney's Aladdin sparked off this trend in this kind of media where you can't tell earnest fairy tales in sort of popular mediums like cinema or television anymore, certainly not for children. Instead, what Aladdin's made the standard is that you have the fairy tale elements intermingled with wisecracking. There's always a character who talks like they're from a postmodern setting, and makes references that are to postmodern culture. I fucking hate that. I loathe that, and I loathe Disney's Aladdin for making it Vogue. It wasn't the first to do it, not by any measure or means, but it's the one that made it really Vogue and made it so that for decades after, there has not been any kind of children's like popular cinema that hasn't had this element. And the worst of it is there are shows that have tried to do it. There are products that have tried to be earnest, but because of Disney's Aladdin, because of the formula that it established, and because it was so fucking popular, you've got studios horning their way in and saying no. In fact, Disney itself is replete with examples of exactly that. The Hunchback of Notre Dame. The Hunchback of Notre Dame is simultaneously the best and the worst of Disney. It's so clear. It's this weird dichotomy of a film where it's split right down the middle. You've got the original inspiration on one side, which is, let's do something different. Let's tell a really, really dark story, an earnest, dark story, without the wisecracking, without the postmodern references. And on the other side, you have the studio interference, where someone has come in and said, it's too dark, it's too grim, we don't make films like this. You've got to throw in some characters that are wisecracking, that are funny, that have that talk like they're from the present day era. And it's almost like a protest the way those two elements do not gel in this film. In fact, the latter, the postmodern elements, grind, and there's such friction between them and the total complete darkness of this film. It would have been a much better product if they just let it run as originally was, by all accounts. It would have been a much more earnest, interesting, and experimental project for Disney, and would have perhaps made up for total failures like Pocahontas. But yes, as we do exist in the post-Aladdin world, we do have this situation. Another good example is from Pixar Brave. By all accounts, Brave was originally going to be this very earnest fairy tale-like story, or sort of like a grim fairy tale, but it was hampered massively by studio interference and by the desire to make it a bit more like a classic Pixar film that has comedy elements and that has wisecracking and whatnot. And you can see it. You can actually not just see it, you can feel it. It's straining against the desire to tell an earnest story, is straining against these condescending ADHD elements where the people responsible for interfering don't understand that children can be mesmerized by an earnest story and don't have to have the jangling multicolored keys in front of their faces all the time. It's really frustrating because you can feel the passion, you can actually feel the earnestness trying to get out of those films. The Hunchback just about gets away with it because you can sort of put away the more postmodern elements. You can sort of wrench them away, and ignore them, and also the darker elements, the more earnest elements are so good. They are so good. It has the best Disney villain by a country mile, Judge Claude Frollo, who is, for one thing, he's not just a bastard. He's not just a bastard for bastardization's sake. He is this complex, neurotic mix of religious fervor and sexual obsession. And I know, right, for a Disney film. And it is sexual obsession. When you look at he has his Disney villain song like all the others, but his is actually really good. He's standing in front of his fire in his quarters, and he's singing about Esmeralda, who is obsessing him. And you actually see a sort of avatar of her forming out of the flames, dancing very provocatively. It's really cool. For a Disney film, it's absolutely stunning. It really is. It breaks bounds for Disney, and it's just a shame that the rest of the film couldn't live up to that. But this is the legacy of Aladdin, basically. And regarding the storyteller specifically, it makes me very scared. It makes me very scared that any new attempt to recreate the show will have those elements. It will be postmodern. It will be wisecracking. It will be a sort of referential. It will have analogs to all sorts of like popular culture memes and things. That would kill me. I would be so phenomenally sad to see that. I have to say, because that's not what the storyteller is. The storyteller is earnest. It is exactly what it says on the tin. It is somebody telling stories, telling old folk tales. It is very much the mass media age's version of telling oral tales around the campfire. It's very much that, and I don't want it to be anything other than that. It doesn't need it. It doesn't need it. All it needs is someone as deft and as articulate and as mesmerizing in the storyteller's chair as Michael Gambon or John Hurt. And it needs that wonderful sense of the dreamlike and the fantastical that the original show has. It needs to hit that mark. For my money, I hope it does. There is something else as well coming up very soon. There's the Dark Crystal TV series. The Dark Crystal is often lumped alongside Labyrinth as an iconic 80s Jim Henson product for children, and it is very good. I mean, the original Dark Crystal is an absolutely beautiful show, and it actually has some of my favourite Jim Henson puppets in it in the form of the Skeksis. The Skeksis are these wonderful creations. They are these avatars of sort of elemental darkness and cruelty. They're fantastical creatures that look like humanoid vultures. There are 12 of them, I believe, and each and every one of them is beautifully characterized. They all have these aspects, like one of them is the Chamberlain, one of them is the Emperor, one of them is the Scientist, one of them is the Alchemist. They all have these sort of aspects and roles assigned to them, and they're all very, very specific in those roles. They actually look like the roles that they fulfill. They're very highly characterized, and they're very impressive puppets because they have all of these very elaborate facial animations that are all mechanized, but which lend them this incredible array of expression. If you ever watch The Dark Crystal again, look at the Skeksis when they're in the background, when they're just expressing, and look at the range of emotion they show on their faces. It's absolutely phenomenal. It really is very impressive. The TV show that's coming up, by all accounts, is kind of a prequel. It's going to tell the story of how the situation in the Dark Crystal film came about. And that's very interesting. That could be very interesting indeed. But once again, I hope they avoid the pitfalls. I hope they don't try to modernize it too much. I hope they don't try to make it too populist. I hope they don't try to make it too light and too sort of wisecracking or anything like that. Whatever humor exists in that world should be of that world. It should not be pandering. It should not condescend to its audience, especially when you consider that, of course, the audience has grown up now. Although I imagine it will reach children, it will primarily be watched by people who loved the Dark Crystal when they were kids. I.e. my generation, by and large. So we don't need it. We don't need the wisecracking. We don't need the Pomo references. We don't need references to the popular world. We just don't need them. And neither do we. I don't think we want them either. I mean, I have issues even with, I mean, much as I love Peter Jackson's adaptations of The Lord of the Rings, whenever there's a reference that's just slightly too out of Middle-earth, I wince. You know, I tend to, oh, stop that, please. I really don't like that. There's a sequence in the Fellowship of the Ring where I know it's not in the Fellowship of the Ring, it's in the Two Towers, where the Uruk-hai orcs turn on Saruman's orcs and basically butcher them. And one of the Uruk-hai has the line, "Looks like meat is back on the menu, boys." It's such a stupid line because the Uruk-hai have only just been born, for one thing. They're sort of like genetically engineered, I suppose, creations of Saruman. Not only that, they're orcs, they're monsters in some fantasy world, so the notion that they have beamed to a restaurant and they've seen a menu and know what a menu is fucking ridiculous. It's absolutely absurd. And it has the effect of taking you out of the fantasy, of taking you out of that world, of showing you that it's a created thing. Really don't like that. Really don't like it. The Hobbit's worse. As in most things, The Hobbit is worse in that regard. But then The Hobbit had 5 whole studios interfering in it, so that's kind of inevitable, really. Um, Although the worst thing in The Hobbit is the dwarf elf romance, which just didn't need to be there. That is the most ridiculous thing ever. Just didn't need to be there. Tacked on, introduced because the studios demanded it. Need a love interest, need a love triangle, blah 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 blah. Such a synthetic, lazy thing. Certainly doesn't need to be in the Hobbit, which is a story about. It's a holly jolly fantasy story about dwarves and a hobbit going to steal gold from a dragon. That's all it is. It didn't need all of the silliness lamped onto it. It really didn't. But yeah, the Storyteller, enormous potential. I feel enormous potential for this to be something very special indeed. I mean, another hope of mine is that they actually run with puppets. I hope Jim Henson does it. I hope the Jim Henson studio does it. I hope it's exclusively puppetry. I really don't want it to be CG or anything like that because I think that isn't going to work. I really don't think that's going to work. That may have the effect of diluting the essential feeling of this show. It doesn't need it either. It just does not need it, especially if it's presented in the way that the original show was. Because the original show is so dreamlike, so legitimately dreamlike, you can forgive any of the ropey special effects or settings or environments or backgrounds or whatnot. It just doesn't matter. It just does not matter. And to be quite frank, not many of them are that ropey anyway. They actually work really, really well. The puppets and the monsters and the creatures and the entities are stunningly characterized. They are so interesting. So interesting. I hope, fingers crossed, ladies and gents, fingers crossed that it's a good one. Because The Storyteller, if you haven't watched it, go get the DVD, go watch it. I think they're all up on YouTube as well. Go watch it because it is sublime. And I guarantee when you've watched it, you'll want to go and get the Grimm fairy tales, and you'll want to go and get Hesiod's Theogony, and you'll want to go and get copies of the Greek myths, and you'll want to read them, you'll want to know about them, because they're so earnestly and passionately told here. So earnestly and passionately told. Righty-ho, ladies and gents, that's me for this one. I will speak to you again shortly. Bye-bye!